The Cold War wasn't won with tanks rolling through Red Square or mushroom clouds lighting up the sky. Nah, what really killed the Soviet Union wasn't some James Bond spy fantasy, it was their wallet. Or more specifically, their complete inability to balance a f***ing checkbook. You see, while everyone was pissing themselves over nukes, the real action was happening in the economy. America didn't need to blow the USSR to pieces, it just needed to make them spend themselves into the grave. And spoiler alert, it worked. Think about it like two guys in a pissing contest. One's got an unlimited tab at the bar, the other can barely afford tap water. Guess who runs out of steam first? Yeah, welcome to Capitalism versus Communism. And before we dive in, smash that subscribe button, because if governments are out here playing Monopoly with our future, the least you can do is learn the rules before they can mortgage your life away. Okay, rewind to 1945. Europe's in ruins, Japan just got nuked into the Stone Age, and America is sitting pretty, like the rich kid who shows up to school with a brand new PlayStation while everyone else is still stuck with a broken GameCube. The US had half the world's industrial output, most of it's gold, and, get this, the dollar became the global reserve currency thanks to the Bretton Woods system. Translation? The greenback wasn't just money, it was the global cheat code. Meanwhile, the Soviets? They had, well, vodka, tanks, and a command economy that ran about as efficiently as dial-up internet. Stalin's USSR could churn out weapons like candy, but when it came to consumer goods, forget it. Want a car? Cool, get in line for 10 years. Want decent toilet paper? Good luck wiping your ass with Pravda. This is where the seeds of the economic war were planted. America had the dollar, the trade networks, and the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. The Soviets had paranoia, secret police, and an economic model that basically said, hey, let's all be equally poor together. Now, the Cold War wasn't just about waving nukes around. It was about showing who could outspend who. The US had something magical. The ability to borrow like a degenerate gambler, but still look respectable. Treasury bonds became the safest asset in the world. People around the globe lined up to finance Uncle Sam's Cold War adventures. The Soviets? Not so much. Nobody was buying Soviet bonds. Imagine trying to sell Kremlin-backed securities on Wall Street. Bro, you'd have a better chance hawking expired milk at Whole Foods. So while the US could fund everything from NASA to NATO on credit, the Soviets had to squeeze their own people. Breadlines got longer, jeans became contraband, and the black market thrived. The average Russian citizen wanted a pair of Levi's more than they wanted Lenin. That's how you know the system was doomed. And here's the kicker. America wasn't just spending on defense. It was flexing soft power with things like the Marshall Plan and consumer culture. Hollywood, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, these were weapons too. The Soviets gave you stale bread, the US gave you Big Macs and Michael Jackson. Guess who won hearts and minds? Currencies is where this fight got really dirty. The dollar was convertible, trusted, and eventually floated free after Nixon ditched the gold standard in 1971. Yeah, Tricky Dick basically said, gold is overrated. We're just printing vibes now. But here's the thing. The world still wanted those vibes. Oil was priced in dollars, trade was settled in dollars. The US could run deficits forever because everyone needed the greenback like it was crack. The ruble, on the other hand, totally worthless outside the Soviet bloc. It was a closed currency, trapped behind the Iron Curtain like a hostage. Imagine showing up in Paris with rubles. Bro, they'd laugh you out of the cafe. Nice play money, comrade. Now go home. This meant the USSR was locked out of the global economy. They could only trade within their little socialist club. And spoiler, East Germany wasn't exactly the cash cow of the century. By the 1970s, the Soviets tried to keep pace with US defense spending. Problem? Their GDP was a fraction of America's. Matching dollar for dollar meant they were bleeding themselves dry. Think about it. If you and Jeff Bezos both decide to buy yachts, who's going bankrupt first? Yeah, exactly. The Soviets were basically that broke cousin trying to keep up with the rich uncle at Christmas. Meanwhile, America's military-industrial complex was pumping cash into Silicon Valley, defense contractors, aerospace, you name it. Those investments eventually gave us microchips, satellites, and the internet. The USSR? They got a pile of rusting tanks and a bunch of scientists working with equipment that looked like it was stolen from Radio Shack. And when oil prices tanked in the 1980s, the Soviet Union's main cash cow collapsed. Suddenly, they couldn't even afford their own dysfunctional system. It was like watching a guy max out his last credit card, then realizing the ATM won't even give him cash back anymore.
By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union looked tough on paper. Biggest military on Earth, nukes out and half of Europe under its boot. But under the hood, the engine was already coughing like a busted Lada on a Siberian highway. Enter Ronald Reagan, aka Cowboy-in-Chief. Reagan figured out something genius. You don't need to fight the Soviets with missiles if you can just drown them in receipts. So he went full economic Mortal Kombat. First move, ramp up U.S. military spending to levels the Soviets couldn't possibly match. We're talking about the Star Wars program. No, not Luke Skywalker, but a proposed missile defense system that made the USSR shit its pants. The idea was to shoot down nukes from space with lasers. Was it technologically possible? Not really, but it didn't matter. The Soviets now had to act like it was. It's like bluffing in poker with the hand of 2-7 offsuit. The Soviets saw America's raise and thought, oh shit, we need to build more nukes, more missiles, more everything. So they poured money into their military like it was bottomless. Spoiler, it wasn't. Meanwhile, America just slapped the costs on the national debt like, put it on my tab. And because the dollar was the world's reserve currency, other countries were more than happy to bankroll Uncle Sam's arms race. Foreign investors lined up to buy U.S. bonds, basically financing America's Cold War flex. The Soviets? Not so much. Nobody was buying Soviet bonds. Imagine trying to sell Kremlin-backed securities on Wall Street. Bro, you'd have a better chance hawking expired milk at Whole Foods. Now here's where the universe really kicked Moscow in the nuts. The Soviet economy leaned hard on oil and gas exports. That was their piggy bank. In the early 80s, global oil prices crashed. Suddenly, the USSR went from petro-rich to broke as hell. Imagine your entire paycheck depends on selling weed, and then everyone in town switches to vaping.
That's what happened to the Kremlin. They couldn't earn enough hard currency to pay for imports, let alone fund their massive military. Meanwhile, Reagan turned up the heat by leaning on Saudi Arabia to pump more oil, driving prices even lower. It was economic warfare straight out of a Bond movie, except instead of assassins, it was barrels of crude flooding the market. And because the ruble was worthless outside the Soviet bloc, the USSR couldn't just print its way out. They had to borrow in dollars. Every time they needed Western technology or grain, they had to go begging to European banks. And trust me, there's nothing more humiliating than the mighty Soviet Union showing up like a broke college kid asking for gas money. While all this was happening, ordinary Soviets were living the dream. If by dream you mean standing in line 3 hours for a moldy cabbage, their stores were empty, housing was a nightmare, and consumer goods were a joke. Remember, this was the 1980s. In America, people were watching MTV, buying Walkmans, and cruising around in shiny new cars. In the USSR, your flex was maybe getting an orange for Christmas. The gap was so obvious it became a propaganda nightmare. You can't convince your citizens that communism is superior when they're secretly listening to Michael Jackson on smuggled cassette tapes. Even the Soviet elite couldn't escape it. Party officials sent their kids abroad, and those kids came back asking, Dad, why do Americans have Nike shoes while we've got whatever this is? The ideological mask was slipping, and economics pulled it right off. Then along came Mikhail Gorbachev. Let's call him Comrade Band-Aid. Gorbachev knew the Soviet economy was a dumpster fire. So he tried to patch it up with perestroika, or economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Problem? You can't put Band-Aids on cancer. Perestroika tried to introduce tiny market reforms into a rigid command economy, and all it did was piss everyone off. Prices went nuts, shortages got worse, and suddenly the whole system looked weaker than ever. Glasnost backfired too. Once people got a taste of free speech, they started asking awkward questions like, hey, why are we spending billions on missiles when I can't find toilet paper? Not exactly the vibe the Politburo was going for. While Gorbachev was juggling reforms, the West smelled blood in the water. Reagan and his buddies tightened trade restrictions, cutting off Soviet access to Western tech. That's why in 1985, American kids were playing Nintendo while Soviet engineers were still trying to copy IBM with machines that sounded like lawnmowers. The US also weaponized finance. Global lenders started demanding higher interest rates from the USSR. Credit dried up. By the late 1980s, Moscow was pawning whatever assets it had just to stay afloat. This was the death spiral. Shrinking oil revenues, ballooning debt, a worthless currency, and citizens fed up with waiting in line for basic food. And yet, the military budget kept guzzling resources like a frat boy at a keg party. By the end of the 80s, the writing was on the wall.
The Soviets were drowning in economic failure. Eastern European satellite states started revolting, demanding freedom and cash flow like the West. And unlike in the past, Moscow couldn't afford to crush them. Tanks are expensive when you can't even afford butter. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, not because NATO tanks rolled in, but because the Soviet treasury rolled over and died. By 1991, the USSR officially dissolved. The so-called evil empire wasn't nuked into oblivion, it went bankrupt like a failed startup that spent too much on vibes and not enough on revenue. The last years of the USSR were pure chaos economics. Inflation was ripping through the ruble like a knife through wet toilet paper. Stores had nothing, shelves were empty, and the black market became the real economy. By 1991, Moscow literally couldn't pay its own soldiers. Think about that. The mighty Red Army, once the terror of Europe, was now basically a collection of armed dudes wondering when their next paycheck was coming. And trust me, you don't want your military guys asking that question. Gorbachev's reforms had opened Pandora's box. National republics like Lithuania, Ukraine, and Georgia looked around and said, "Why are we still chained to this sinking ship?" Independence movements spread like wildfire. Moscow's empire was peeling apart faster than duct tape in a sauna. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Gorbachev resigned, the red flag came down over the Kremlin, and the Cold War was over. Not because World War III happened, not because NATO invaded, but because the USSR overdrew its checking account one too many times. Here's the twist. America didn't exactly win by being fiscally responsible. The US was running up its own debt, printing money and inflating like a balloon animal at a kid's birthday party. But the difference was that America had the dollar. The dollar was liquid gold. Everyone needed it, everyone trusted it, and the US could always find buyers for its debt. When America printed cash, the world shrugged and said, "Sure, we'll take some." When the Soviets printed rubles, their own citizens used them as wallpaper. The Cold War ended, not because communism was militarily weaker, but because capitalism had the ultimate financial cheat code, other people's money. Now let's drag this into the modern day. Because if you're thinking, glad that's over, buddy, don't get too comfortable. The same economic weapons that crushed the USSR are still in play. Take the US today, $35 trillion in debt, money printer running hotter than a Twitch streamer's GPU, and inflation sneaking up like a bad Tinder date. Sound familiar? It should. Rome debased its coins, the Soviets collapsed under debt and shortages, and modern America? Well, let's just say Jeff Bezos is preparing a rocket ship for a reason. Or look at China. They're trying to flex with massive infrastructure projects and military spending, but under the hood they've got ghost cities, a shaky real estate bubble, and debt piling up faster than TikTok challenges. You can almost hear history chuckling, "Oh, you thought you were different." The real Cold War lesson is this. Nukes don't kill empires. Economies do. Weapons win battles, but money wins wars. Here's the crazy part. Economics doesn't just shape wars, it shapes minds. In the US, the promise of consumer freedom, jeans, burgers, rock music, was as much a weapon as any missile silo. People fight for survival, sure, but they live for lifestyle. The Soviet Union lost not just because it went broke, but because its citizens looked at the West and said, "They've got MTV and we've got state TV reading 5-hour speeches. Screw this." Culture, commerce, and credit cards turned out to be stronger than tanks and ideology. So that's why today when you see memes about money printer go burr, it's not just a joke. It's a modern version of the same story. Governments thinking they can bend reality with economics, only to get wrecked by consequences later. So what's the takeaway? Simple. The strongest weapon on Earth isn't a missile. It's a balance sheet. The Cold War proved that bombs can scare you, but budgets decide your fate. America bled the Soviets dry by forcing them to keep up financially. And when they couldn't, the system imploded. Not with mushroom clouds, but with empty shelves and IOUs. Today, the same traps are alive and well. Inflation, debt, currency manipulation. These are the modern nukes. They don't vaporize cities, they vaporize economies. And if you're not paying attention, your savings, your paycheck, your entire financial life can go up in smoke while politicians smile for the cameras. So yeah, history's lesson is clear. The Cold War was won with money, not missiles. And if you think your government has your back, just remember, the USSR told its people the same thing right before it collapsed like a Jenga tower in an earthquake. The barbarians don't always storm the gates.
Sometimes the empire just